The weaknesses of every naval and aerial unit in Noobs in Combat and how not to use them. Naval and aerial units have many weaknesses and bad playstyles that being ignorant to could lose you many games that otherwise would have been completely winnable. To start off, the naval units are very often completely immune to attacks from land units, but can still attack said land units. Do not get carried away with this information since it may cause you to assume that your ship is safer than it is. Units on the water are extremely vulnerable to each other and aerial units when used correctly. The cargo ship is generally most vulnerable to submarines due to its inability to detect them. A submarine can easily sneak through or around your main force, then kill off the cargo ships in the back, which can cripple your entire strategy. Because of this possibility, I recommend trying a strategy where the cargo ships are more surrounded rather than just sitting in the back. The motorboat has high potential damage, but when not supported will prove quite useless. The motorboat's health is generally low, so if you try to rush any large ships with one, it will likely be destroyed even with its high damage. You want to use the motorboat as a tool to overwhelm enemy ships, but this can only be done if it has something backing it up, especially something that can take more hits like a destroyer. The missile boat has absurd range and firepower, which sounds great, but can also be a disastrous combination when ignorant to its weaknesses. Since it has so much range, using it to push would be like using a radioless howitzer to push. On the other hand, keeping the missile boat far behind the fighting lines makes it just as vulnerable to submarines as the cargo ship. This means you have to find the sweet spot where it is protected but still useful. Once again, if you have room, try to surround it with other ships. The diesel sub's weakness is admittedly quite obvious, but the methods of avoiding it are less so. As you likely know, the destroyer unit has 3 depth charge attacks, which usually one-tap submarines. These are extremely dangerous when paired with the destroyer's sonar that can help it locate your submarine. A good way of getting around it is by targeting ships without a depth charge, and by doing so quickly. The more time you give the enemy ships, the more information they can gather, since both destroyers and all subs have sonar. The cruiser sub's weaknesses are completely different to that of the diesel sub, as its intended purpose is completely different as well. The cruiser sub's submarine abilities are more so used to reposition itself rather than to attack directly. Though it has access to a torpedo, it is most effectively used as artillery since it can launch a seaplane with a radio, which actually allows for the usage of its artillery. However, unlike most ships, it is somewhat safer to let the cruiser sub go off on its own, since it has sonar to detect other subs and can escape very easily. So while it is pretty expensive, the cruiser sub has nearly no real weaknesses when used by someone who knows its abilities well. Destroyers are great jack-of-all-trades ships that can effortlessly defend their fellow naval units when all of their features are taken advantage of. They are the best unit in the game for dealing with submarines and have a way of defending against every single other unit in the game. The real weakness of the destroyers is not having enough of them. With a group, their firepower and abilities are amazing, but by themselves they can be overwhelmed, which will leave all of your fancy top-of-the-line Scrooge McDuck ships completely exposed. When paired with the radio, the cruiser has very good offensive abilities, but can still be overwhelmed by multiple smaller units. Honestly, it's just as simple as buying destroyers to defend the cruiser sub, since it will have a very difficult time doing that by itself. Not weakness related, but I do think it's good to know that the destroyer can manually activate its anti-air attack, which makes it stronger against aerial vehicles than most other ships. The battleship is just the cruiser sub if all of its abilities were strengthened alongside its weaknesses as well. It is extremely strong when paired with radio units, which isn't hard to do since it can carry a seaplane. But since it is so expensive, you are much less likely to purchase adequate defenses. Again, please buy at least 2 destroyers before trying to push, otherwise the battleship will be extremely vulnerable to everything. However, even if your destroyer defense is strong enough, still look out for enemy radio units since the battleship can be one-shot by missile boats. The seaplane tender also relies on other units for survival, however, what it can rely on is a bit more broad. It typically holds seaplanes which enable artillery. The best way of defending it is with that. The only thing you still need to be careful of is that you at least keep a seaplane nearby so its radio can be used for defense rather than just offense. The aircraft carrier is very expensive for a unit that can barely defend itself at all. The only thing it can kind of work around is aerial vehicles, so it is essential that you protect it from submarines and other offensive naval units. This can be done most effectively with a destroyer as usual. Also, please do not convince yourself that the aircraft in the carrier will be able to defend it, since most ships can counter said aircraft. Aircraft are extremely vulnerable to their weaknesses, but if you can get around them, they will be effectively untouchable by any of the enemy units. Generally, you want to watch out for the anti-airgun tree and or getting too close to enemy ships. The spotter is a very good recon and radio unit, but is most vulnerable to ground anti-air units that it couldn't see. Often you'll be tempted to fly your spotter over an island to figure out exactly what is waiting for you there, but what you may forget is that if anti-air units are hiding in the forested areas, you will only find out after it's too late. The best way of countering this is by simply taking your time. The spotter has a lot of mobility and a lot of fuel, so it does have the resources to be careful. The seaplane is most commonly used as a radio to fight against enemy naval units, but that of course brings up the issue of said naval units almost always having a way of obliterating it. Just make sure you aren't getting too close, and the artillery should do the rest of the work. The torpedo bomber is a great way of dealing huge damage to large ships while being able to get around their anti-air guns. The main weakness of the torpedo bomber is the lack of knowledge of what ships it should attack and what ships it should avoid. It's hard to get concrete information on ambush ranges from the game or the wiki, so I recommend playing around with the torpedo bomber first if you want to use it in high difficulty games or PvP. The armed heli is usually in a completely different ballpark than the rest of the aerial units, since it can be deployed on many more maps and is used very differently from anything else in the game. It is very effective against large groups of lightly armored vehicles or infantry, while not necessarily being weak to medium or heavily armored units. The main threat to the heli is its low amount of fuel. You need to be sure that it will have enough to get to the enemies, stay long enough to attack once or twice, then come back and land. It's a lot to keep track of, but if you don't, it will likely be destroyed prematurely. One more thing to keep in mind is that it cannot land on the same turn it attacked, which could be the killing blow if it has one fuel left. The fighter is a mobile aerial unit typically used to fight off other aerial units or light ground units. I'd say it's weak to the jet fighter as it has a very slight advantage, but the main thing you want to worry about is heavy hitting anti-air units like the anti-air cannon or SPAG. This is because it can easily escape from the other anti-air units with its mobility. Of course, that's impossible if it gets one-tapped. The jet fighter has extremely similar weaknesses to the fighter, but they are just slightly less of a threat. It has unbelievably high mobility and a little extra armor. Of course, this does not make it remotely invincible. It is still weak to the heavy-hitting anti-air you haven't already dealt with via your ground units, and overestimating how far it can go with its mobility. Just remember, its fuel isn't anything crazy, so the distance it can cover will be less than you think. The dive bomber is also weak to heavy-hitting anti-air units, but is at its worst against other aerial units like fighters or jet fighters. It cannot attack them, which makes it completely defenseless against them. However, if you have fast-moving anti-air or fighter of your own, they will usually be enough to protect against them. Just be sure to know if the place you are bombing has the heavy-hitting anti-air I've been talking about. That concludes another Noobs in Combat series. I greatly appreciate new video ideas, so if you have any, now's the time to share. Also, I'm curious whether you guys found this series focused on unit weaknesses or the previous one focused on unit strengths to be more helpful. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. That of course is assuming that you're going to like and subscribe.